I'm live. I'm reading out of The Laird and the Lady. It's a novel by Joan Marshall Grant, who used to write books about her previous incarnations. She died in 1989. She wrote 7 books about her previous lives, but this one is a novel, and it is about Marylda and Rowan. Marylda is an American heiress, and Rowan lives in a Scottish castle. They're married now, and we are finding out a little bit more about the background and about Emilie. Housewarming, Chapter 3 of the 3rd part. God bless Mrs. Grummet, said Rowan, who with Georgina had just waved goodbye from the terrace to Marylda's senior trustee, whom she was driving to Inverness to catch the London train. When he arrived, I thought he was no more than a tiresome little lawyer, but what a marvellous stroke of luck that he turned out to have a passion for antiques and gave Marylda a hobby. She's been quite all right since he came. I mean, no more Emilie trouble. It's done the girl a world of good. At first I was a little worried that she insisted on having everything done so quickly. I thought she might be trying to fumigate the rooms that Emilie had lived in. If you can imagine anyone trying to get rid of a ghost as though it was no worse than black beetles. But then I realized it was only their American hustle, and I suppose it's better to live with the smell of paint and varnish remover highly concentrated for weeks, instead of being less disturbed for months. She decided to have the new wing pulled down in the new year. I think that's a good sign, though of course she agrees that it's hideous. But why have the dance first? Why not in the drawing room? Rowan, you'll have to be careful on the New Year's Eve. More careful than usual. Why? You mean because everyone is apt to be a bit tight and it would be extra tricky if Emilie butted in? She avoided answering until they were back in the library, and to conceal renewed anxiety he put logs on the fire with elaborate care. Why special attention to your New Year's Eve? That was the night it happened. What happened? I don't know. Emilie, in the evening, Hector was annoyed because she danced 3 times running with Roderick. She ran up to her bedroom and locked herself in. I heard him arguing with her through the door. I thought they had made it up, for she came downstairs and seemed very gay. It wasn't until after supper that I missed her. Hector must have had more to drink than I realized, for he was very odd when he explained to the guest that his wife was feeling ill and had asked him to make her excuses. When I offered to go to see her, he was angry and told me that I was to leave her alone. He said the illness was only an excuse and that she wanted no one with her. I realized later that they must have had a second, far more serious quarrel. Didn't she ever tell you about it? How could she? Said Georgina flatly. I never saw her again. You mean she ran away that night? In the morning she had gone, and so had Gaston and the car. Hector was terribly upset. He wouldn't see anyone, and I had to tell the house party that they both had ptomaine, and the doctor had forbidden any visitors. It was Hector who had everything belonging to her taken up to the old nursery. I was surprised that he was so sure she would never come back. At the time I was fool enough to be glad he didn't wait for her to ask his forgiveness. I thought it meant he was glad to be rid of her. And wasn't he? She tried to smile. He wasn't rid of her. At first I thought it was only that he couldn't put her out of his mind, but then he started to talk to her, and when he was drunk and alone. I know, because I used to listen at the door. He used to say, "My God, will you never leave me in peace?" It got worse after he came back from Paris, though it was before he had the letter that he bricked up the staircase and sealed the door. Once he tried to joke about it and asked me soon after we were married whether I objected to living in a ménage à trois. I pretended not to understand what he meant. I thought he would grow out of it in a year or two, and prefer to think I had never noticed what was happening. Several times I nearly asked Roderick if he knew anything, but he avoided coming to Cloud unless Hector gave him an express invitation. I suppose he felt guilty at the part he had played in breaking the marriage. He went to South Africa soon afterwards and died of enteric in the second year of the war. So you're afraid that Marylda might confuse Duncan with Roderick? No, dear, but I want you to remember that if she is provocative, it will not be her fault, but Emilie's. If you quarrelled, well, I'm probably being absurdly apprehensive, but I want you to promise not to lose your temper. He produced an unconvincing parody of a light laugh. A quiet evening on cold tea, just to be on the safe side? Pity I can't warn Duncan to watch his step too, for if I catch him playing Roderick to Marylda's for Emilie, I might be a bit brusque. The old boy's more than half in love with her, as any man would be who wasn't deaf and blind. But I'm sure he'd never tell her, even if he was tight. I wish Janet wasn't coming to the dance, she said wistfully. He put his arm around her shoulders. Darling, that's nonsense. You underrate yourself if you think that Janet could remind anyone of you at 19. She smiled at him. Far too kind a compliment for an old woman who is proving herself senile by the most ridiculous fancies. I'm ashamed of myself. Of course, you're perfectly right. This party will be Emilie's positively last appearance, and then we can pull down the wing and forget all about her. Except as the legendary great-aunt of your grandchildren, and what could be more innocuous? What could, agreed Georgina, almost as though she meant it. As Marylda and Mrs. Grummet came to the crest of the hill above Inverness, she drew the car into the side of the road and switched off the engine, so that he could appreciate the view of the Black Isle and the mountains beyond the Firth. Scotland is a remarkably beautiful country, he declared. I'm glad that you live here, though I must admit that when I heard of your precipitate marriage I was more than a little alarmed. The former alliance between Blenkinsop and Cairdry had not been, shall we say, entirely satisfactory. Darling Grummy, but you're quite happy about me, now? He cleared his throat. Your husband and his excellent grandmother have put my doubt to rest. And the way in which the clan have rallied to carry out the redecorations which were so urgently required is nothing short of miraculous. Admit that you thought Georgina must be a barbarian when you first saw the attics. He blushed. Was I so ineffective in my efforts to conceal my feelings? Utterly, darling, but they thought you were only a little overwhelmed. I was, my dear, I was. Seldom have I experienced such horror as when I saw the scandalous neglect of what are virtually priceless treasures. How fortunate that ignorance saved them from the salesroom. Consider the set of 16 Queen Anne chairs with the original needlework. 3 in the housekeeper's room, fortunately protected by slipcovers of an abominable cretonne, which I gather was chosen by Mrs. MacTaggart. 4 more in the attic because they require some trivial repair. One can only hope that the Royal Society of Needlework will be able to restore the ravages of mice. The rest relegated to rooms more occupied by footmen. I thought you reacted even more strongly to the gesso console tables we discovered in the saddle room, or the walnut bureau which someone had thoughtfully concealed under 5 layers of mustard yellow paint. When your husband told me that this almost unique specimen had come in very handily for storing nails, I was only saved from a severe attack of gastric trouble by a double dose of Akali. He seemed oblivious that the pedigree of his furniture adds greatly to its value, and admits that it would have been sold long ago to repair the farm buildings if if it had not been entailed. Quite casually he mentions that many of the pieces were given to an ancestor by Queen Anne, and adds that probably no one took the risk of offending the old girl by producing anything but their best stuff. I must frankly confess that after our initial discoveries I contemplated an immediate return to the States, to avoid further shocks which might easily have brought on a reoccurrence of my stomach ulcer. But if you'd gone, we'd never have been able to wrangle all those priorities. It is wonderful what influence will do when used in the right quarters. It was genius to recognize that by paying in dollars, we could not only help Britain, but also get immediate delivery of everything we needed. If I may say so, I think I helped to smooth over the trivial inconvenience caused to your new relatives by such a horde of workmen when I suggested a way of lightening not only the castle, but most of the farms as well, by means of an adequate electrical installation run by water power. She smiled. The children may be rather dubious about the bathrooms, but the women who are looking forward to electric cooking stoves and electric irons, and the farmers are delighted at the prospect of giving up milking by hand. By next year we should be able to find work on the place for 300 or 400 people, most of them cadres. Rowans full of schemes for making us virtually self-supporting. We're putting lots more land under cultivation, and we're going to start making Tweed and Ayrshire cheese and special hams. We shall send them to the best shops in London and build up a snob clientele, so even if dollars lose their value, we shall be secure in our Highland fortress. I think, darling, that I'm learning how to use money properly at last. I told you before, my dear, if I may remind you, that it was useless to run away from your inheritance. You had to use it instead of letting it abuse you. Dear Grummy, she said affectionately, I've been a great trial to you over you one way or another, but I'm far more grateful than you will ever guess. He took off his pince-nez glasses and polished them vigorously on his handkerchief before replying, I'm exceedingly fond of you, and strictly between ourselves I was devoted to your Aunt Emilie. In fact, I never entirely recovered from the shock of her death, for which I considered myself partly to blame. But how was it your fault? I should have been more courageous, gone to Paris and assured her that her father's anger would spend itself in due course, that she had nothing to fear in coming home. But when I think of her alone and friendless, driven to take her life because she believed that her own people had cast her out without even giving her a chance to defend herself, well, I become so agitated that I have to take luminol to calm my nerves. Even if she had gone back to America, I doubt whether Gaston would have been welcome. If Grandpapa Blenkinsop was anything like my father, he must have been an appalling snob. Clasping the errant daughter to the family bosom is one thing that welcoming a foreign chauffeur as a co-correspondent would have been too much. So they never told you? My dear, that was very wrong of them. I blame your father. He had no right to conceal the truth. What truth? Emilie did not run away with Gaston. The moment a letter came from Sir Hector informing my firm, the family lawyers, that her dowry was being returned as she preferred a chauffeur, I was convinced that Emilie would not have acted in such a way. It was obvious that she intended to join some other man. If she had merely found Cloud intolerable, she would have come home. My father preferred to believe the story. He dismissed my faith in her good taste as the sentimental vaporing of a boy in his early 20s. I pursued my inquiries and discovered that Gaston had sailed from Glasgow to Canada 5 days after Emilie left Cloud. On the same day that I made this vital discovery, we received the news that Emilie had been buried in Paris. I tried to make the family admit that they had sorely misjudged her. I quarrelled with my father, who threatened to cut me off with $1. I even argued with old Blenkinsop in his own house, a formidable undertaking. They all took the view that as Emilie had brought a scandal on the name and increased it by suicide, the least said about it, the better. Oh, poor Grummy, it must have been so awful for you. Thank you, my dear. He blew his nose, the small, precise nose which was the keynote of his neat, formal person. I took fencing lessons for several years. I pretended it was only to keep myself fit. Actually, it was because I cherished the hope that one day I should discover the name of Emilie's betrayer and run him through. However, as he must now be over 70, even if he is still alive, I have decided that such romantic dreams are no longer practical, but I still dream about it at times. He drew out his old half-hunter. I have talked quite enough, and unless we hurry, we shall be late for my train. The Scots, I'm glad to find, are a punctual people, unlike most foreigners. She smiled and let in the clutch. For the first time she found it odd to hear the Scots described as foreigners. Home no longer meant America, but Cloud. So, the next chapter is chapter 4, Christmas Tree. Happy Sunday!